All right. Hi, everybody. As people filter in, we're going to begin at 3:30. All right. Hi, everybody. It's 3:30, and we're going to kick off the start of our emergency animal transport panel. My name is Haley Randall. I'm the program assistant for the Zoo and Aquarium All Hazards Partnership, and we're really excited to have you here with us today. We have some really great panelists. We're going to turn it over to them in just a minute. But first, I just wanted to go through a few quick logistics. First, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website, zap.org, in just a few days. We will have a Q&A portion of this webinar following our panelists' presentations, and we encourage you to submit questions when we get to that portion of the webinar, and we will have our panelists answer those for you. We will have transcriptions enabled for this webinar. That'll be at the bottom of your screen, and we will be here to assist you. You can, if you have any questions or if you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to message me or Ashley Zielinski. And now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Dawn Moore, to kick us off. Go ahead, Dawn.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. You know, I've got over 45 years in the zoo industry, and part of that was focused on safety and risk and contingency planning, as a lot of you know. But when you think about risk in the simplest sense, you think about your threats and the vulnerability to the threat category. We know there are many hazards that can harm or even destroy our animals, and some of those are the weather hazards that we've been having that you're probably familiar with, like hurricanes, floods, fires, snow events, things like that. And we try to prepare for them, right? And then there's the vulnerability, and we can think of vulnerability and mitigating that to mitigate our losses in terms of the human vulnerability, like an injury, physical vulnerability, like a vehicle breakdown during an emergency animal transport, economic vulnerability, like the cost of the response or the cost of your permits, cultural vulnerability, like the loss of endangered species. And so today we've got a panel of subject matter experts that will share with you how to mitigate vulnerability from their points of view and respond to the emergency with a very, very distinct focus on emergency animal transport. So we're going to move through the panelists. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and their area of expertise before they make a short presentation. And then before 90 minutes is over, we'll have a question and answer session. So feel free to put your questions into the question and answer box. We've got some loaded already, some pre-questions. So thanks again for joining us. And with that, Frank Kohn, I believe you're up.
I am, and let me see if I can. So this is gonna stop others from sharing the screen, I guess. So I guess I'll have to do that. Let's see if I can. This should work. Let's see. All right, is that working for everybody? All right, thank you. So yeah, my name's Frank Kohn. I am a biologist and CITES specialist, policy specialist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I've been with the service since 2002. Prior to that, I was in zoos working in zoos. Maybe I should have belonged in zoos since 1978. Did my master's thesis at Front Royal and worked at New Orleans Zoo and at the National Zoo for 19 years. While there, I managed the North American Red Panda SSP, helped manage that. And I did my share of animal transports. And so at the service, my primary role is dealing with wildlife regulations. And so what I'm going to do today is really just give a brief overview of the regulations to remind you of those and to talk about emergency preparedness. I've been teaching a class since I think it's 2015, along with Rochelle Rogers. Don was involved with that too. We do a class on animal transport for the animal care professional, and it's really A to Z review of everything you need to know about transport. So we'll just talk here about just in terms of a review. So as you can see, I mean, regulations can be a scary thing. Sometimes we want to cover our eyes about, but if I can get this to advance, I'll be very happy. Let's see. There we go. There are a lot of different regulations that we need to be aware of. The Endangered Species Act, the US federal regulations, the Animal Welfare Act, the Lacey Act amendments of 1981, Lacey Act of the early 1900s were the first animal regulations. And then the Iata live animal regulations, which we call the LAR. And those really are the standard for air transport. But typically what can be used for air transport can be used for most other transport situations. Although several years ago, we did develop guidelines for the non-air transport of some species, because some species do require different considerations when you're moving them by ground because of the length of time. But really, if you want to eliminate the majority of things that can go wrong in ground transport, air transport is the fastest way to go. That plane's going to go up and it's got to come down one of two ways. And that's really the most reliable way of doing it. USDA has their transport regulations, which we need to follow. You can see the old blue book, and that has turned into a different book, but it's pretty much the same thing. This diagram about packing a deer for transport came from one of my predecessors. Yes, you do need to put tennis balls on antlers, but you're really not supposed to transport any animal when it's in antlers, and bubble wrap just doesn't work most of the time. There are individual state regulations that we also have to follow. So if you're going to be crossing state boundaries, you're going to have to follow those regulations. And in general, and Al will talk mostly about the ground transport, but when my rule is when you're transporting animals across state lines, or anytime you're transporting on the roads, you want to let as many of the authorities know that this is going on. So if you have an accident, if you have a situation, if you have to call the police for any reason, they're going to know that you're serious, that it's not, when you're saying there's a tiger out, that you're not just somebody looking at a cat that is really not a tiger. And this happened in Georgia a couple of years ago, that some tigers did get out of a transport. Our esteemed Don Moore is in this picture, as you can see, checking a transport. And you want to also make sure that you have equipment available. In this situation, there was an animal that was transported in a wooden crate, and the crate was lined with aluminum after it was constructed, and so the aluminum wasn't dovetailed in the joints, and the animal managed to peel it away. It looked like it was very bloody inside, but the animal really had very few injuries just because it had been in there for a long time. So you want to make sure that your equipment is good. Now, I really want to go over this because I've learned over the years that not everyone's familiar with this. So I deal with CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Endangered species is a term, but the Endangered Species Act is not the same as CITES. The Endangered Species Act is specific only to the United States, importing and exporting. If the species is listed in the ESA, you need to get an ESA permit on that certification. If it's CITES listed, that needs to be on that permit as well. But CITES is global and does not affect interstate transport. ESA is US and does affect interstate transport when it's a commercial transaction. Okay, so ESA only affects the United States. If you're shipping an animal from Denmark to China, and it's an ESA listed animal, you don't need anything at all in terms of ESA. If it's CITES listed, you'll need a CITES permit. You will, and the ESA, the prohibited acts include not only the import and export, but take, possession, and interstate and foreign commerce in illegally taken species of ESA listed species. So if you're going to do this legally and you have all your permits, so take is taking an animal without having that permit. There's also, that's harassment is also part of that. If something happens to an ESA listed species, that can be considered harassment, even if it is something unpredictable. When an animal dies, or if you have to euthanize one, you have to contact our office. If you have an ESA listed species and you're going to sell it, if there's going to be a commercial transaction, you need to get a permit. If it's a loan, you don't need to worry about that. And most zoos are involved with loans there, with loans on those animals. So if you're going to cross the state with a commercial transaction, you need that permit. Now, ESA, what would it cover for the zoos? In most cases, where we're looking at here, things that you'd need to worry about where it's ESA would be things like marine mammals. And this is really not even ESA, this is more the Marine Mammal Protection Act, okay? So, and then I bring this up because this is what happened with Katrina. Audubon needed to move animals out of the state quickly. And so they had seals. Seals are covered by NOAA's NMFS, or National Marine Fisheries. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife, we cover sea otters, polar bears, manatees, and walruses. NOAA's covers all the other marine mammals. If you have to move an animal quickly, you need to contact one of our offices, depending on what the species are. So, and we allow for emergency consultation. Nothing needs to be published in the Federal Register, but there's a 15-day period of moving it. But if you need to move a seal out for medical emergency, for a weather event, for whatever's happening, the pool is cracked, you just need to contact one of the, for seals, you'd need to contact NMFS, and I'll give you that information here. For the ones that Fish and Wildlife covers, you just need to contact our offices, and we will work with you. So, and just as an example, last year during, we're all teleworking now, and I got a call from somebody that was trying to import an animal from Asia. And because of airlines being shut down, they needed to get that animal out, but their permit was about to expire. And they would have shipped it when the permit was good, but it would have arrived in the US after the permit had expired. They contacted me, I contacted the port of entry, and they said, we'll take care of it. So the wildlife inspectors will work with you, okay? I'm not saying we're gonna make exceptions, but if you let us know, the biggest advice I can tell you is when you're doing a transport and you have to get in touch with inspectors, you're not sure, contact the inspectors at the port, let them know. They know that zoos are working in a different way than commercial importers and exporters. That's not to say they're going to give you an advantage, but they will work with you because they know more about the what's going on with your work, that there might be a conservation or emergency issue involved with it. So here's all the information that you can get on the screen here from NMFS Fisheries. I found out finally that's what they prefer to be called. And you can call them at this number, and they'll be happy to work with you. So medical, weather emergencies, whatever. Again, transports normally require a 15-day notice. That can be waived. They just want to know what's going on. So be in touch with the government agencies and they will work with you. In terms of airlines, there are currently only 2 passenger airlines in the United States that are moving animals right now, as far as I know. There are some other cargo airlines that you can work with as well. And because the airlines, there are only 2, there are fewer options. And there are a lot of issues going on in terms of getting direct flights from one place to another and how much room there is in those airline compartments. And it's really complex. Sometimes because of the mergers that it involved, one airline ordered their cargo area without temperature sensors, and the other one has temperature sensors, but because they don't know what equipment's going to be coming in, they can't always make those reservations. So call ahead, and you may need to call the actual cargo coordinators, the the global cargo coordinators, and I can help you with that. So let me know. If you call your local offices, a lot of airlines are now contracting out at the local area. You may get a different response, but let me know. We can work together. I know there have been some issues, but again, because now we're only working with two, the third airline is only taking domestic animals. It's not taking wildlife, and that's had a big effect on some of the conservation programs. I'm trying to organize airlines to come to one of the AZA meetings, the conferences. We're trying to get them to come to our transport class this year, and I think we do have some participants. I'm going to let Al talk about the ground transport issue, and I'm going to stop here with one of my favorite cartoons that I found last year, and a way not to transport otters. And so I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have, and I'm going to pass this over to Rochelle.
Okay, thank you. Okay, my name is Rochelle Rogers, and I have been in the zoo business 53 years, started as a kid volunteer, worked in frontline animal care, became a supervisor. Then the last 20 years was as a registrar. I worked in Miami as my last job. Now I'm actually doing outreach work to help people with their records, to improve their records, or help them with permitting applications so that they can get those done. Today is going to be more about things that you can do before you have an emergency, so that when the emergency happens, hopefully a lot of things will already be pre-set up for certain types of emergencies, like maybe weather disasters, things like that. And as we know, things like the fires can happen really fast. Most government agencies operate with the incident command system, and registrars are an asset to zoos because they can stay in their office and do all of this work while people are out in the field taking care of the animals. And that's one of the things that I think is very valuable. If you have a registrar on hand, they know the staff, they can act as a conduit for information. They also have a good rapport with the wildlife agencies because they deal with them a lot. They can ask for things for you and then communicate back to the incident command leader what's been happening or what might need to be done, and vice versa. Also, there's different reasons for transport. It may be a weather event that's an emergency. Frank mentioned the Audubon Zoo and Katrina. Identifiers for your animals. If your animal gets out, or there's an event where its exhibit is burned down and you're looking for it, they had a special situation in that they are near the Gulf and there are dolphins in the wild, but they had trained dolphins. So the only way they could identify their animals is the trainer would ask them to do a behavior, and they could say that's our dolphin, that's not a wild one. So make sure that you have all of your identifiers in order, your inventories, and any kind of contingency plan. Make sure everybody's thoroughly trained in it so they can, at a moment's notice, jump into action. This is one of the main areas that registrars are helpful to an institution. All the legal documents, all the government agency paperwork, which has become more and more heavy as time goes by, more permits, more types of forms to fill out, longer forms. Sometimes the forms change every year. Your registrar doing that job is going to know what has changed, or they'll know who to ask. Also, the community is very interactive. And during COVID, there was a great Excel file that was shared between registrars about shipping, about are you in your office? Because literally, if an institution did not have electronic communication, electronic signatures, they were shut down until they could get back to the office. And in some cases, they came back to all their mail in a big stack in their office. Also, there's been discussion about who's responsible for what. And at certain times, you may have an animal on loan that needs to be moved. If you think about that ahead of time and maybe include in your loan agreement, where do you want this animal to go in the event of an emergency or it needs to be evacuated? If you know that ahead of time, it's going to help your zoo out a lot faster to say, hey, we're in that situation. We're going to move this animal to so-and-so zoo or back to you, whatever their wishes were. Also, during transport, the sender is the one that's responsible for sending the animal. Once the animal is received by the institution that's receiving, they have to fill out if it's an APHIS 7020, did it arrive alive? Some of those things in times of crisis, like with Hurricane Harvey, there were certain states that allowed for things to go through and then follow up with paperwork after. But you have to have a really good communication line open with those people. You have to have contacted them. This would be something like if you have a migratory bird or you have a bald eagle you got to move, they can only go to another permit holder, but they're willing to work with you, as Frank said, and overcome some of these barriers to making sure the animals are taken care of. So always know who is responsible. Some zoos will have even a transport contract. That's something that's becoming more and more frequent. Before it was unheard of. Now there are transport contracts. So that would mean the transporter that has the animal is responsible until it gets to the destination. This is part of logistics, training. When you have your contingency plan written up, it is AZA standard for every 3 months, every 4 months to do training. All the roles should be involved in that training so that if somebody has to step in and do a certain action or role, and it's not a bad idea to have cross training. God forbid you have your key person on vacation when an emergency happens and somebody has to step in and not know what they're supposed to do. Anybody got any questions? I'm happy to answer your questions. If you want to put them in the chat box, and I'll turn this over now to Mr. Alan Saronin. Alan Saronin.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. I went too fast, sorry.
So my topic is animal transport considerations during natural disasters. I've been doing animal transport and consulting for zoos for about the last 10 years after I retired from Cleveland Metro Park Zoo. I was curator of mammals and mammalogy there for about 35 years. So to learn a little bit about natural disaster transport, I called up my friends that transport animals to find out their experiences in natural transport, and let's see what was asked and what the responses were. So 10 transporters were contacted with 10 responses. The questions I asked were there any participation in disaster transports during pre-event, during the event, or post-event? Any on-call status? Any on standby status? Do you have any MOAs or MOUs? And then what type of natural disasters did you assist with? And any advice or helpful hints? So I'll just go through the answers real quick. International Animal Exchange, I talked to Holly Hunt. She has an MOA with Ohio Zoos. There's a collaborative document for assistance with staff holding capacity equipment. No transports were performed by IE during the last years. Planned migration, Chris Danhauser, he had one hurricane-related transport about 10 years ago. No on-call or on standby. His advice was to practice and to be able to do quick loading. Jacob Rohr of Our Lazy J Wildlife Ranch has done property moves of animals in 2018 Hurricane Michael, assisted in repairs at Zoo World, and were recently on call for fires at Arizona. He was on standby with crates, trailers, and ready to move animals off of that. No MOAs. Marcus Hemker has assisted the Minot Zoo and Roosevelt Park Zoo in 2001 during their flooding. He has received calls and requests. He's been on standby. And he has said that planning is the most important thing for the disasters that occur in your area. Talked to Coleman Feister of Premier Animal Logistics. He's provided lots of transports for private collections, mainly tornado related. He has no MOAs. Clients call him when he needs assistance. Chris Gurley has done no transports and would definitely assist if contacted. We've only had one call about disaster transport for 2 Zoo Logistics, which I work with. It's about 9 years ago. And the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo is looking for all giraffe transporters and the capacity of their trailers to find out if in a fire event, how many giraffe might be able to move from their facility. Talked to Larry Johnson, the Safari Enterprises. He's done no transports pre, during, or post disaster. He's received calls a couple of times for assistance, but he couldn't divert his trucks. He was on another loading area and moving. And so no calls around transports. I talked to Callan Hahn, and he's probably the most experienced in this area. He's assisted with flooding events for zoos, National Institute of Health. He's been on call and standby over 6 times. His concern and want everybody to think about was the many risks that are involved in the transports, power lines, road conditions, hazardous waste. You know, he just said you can't move the whole collection. You maybe move a portion of it. You may talk about triage of your collection if you want to move some of it. And he's very much interested in HAZWOP training in the future. He also talked a little bit to me about maybe disaster triage. You know, he said planning is the most important thing that any zoo can do, or safari park or owner. And he also talked a little bit to me about, you know, maybe having a plan for euthanasia of animals that may not be able to be moved or suffer during a natural disaster area. A lot of laboratory disaster plans have euthanasia as part of their plan. And then I talked to Rudy Holly, and he just assisted one Peace River assistance in 2004, Hurricane Charlie. So 10 transponders, one MOA, lots of flooding or hurricane transports are the most requested, 1 fire request, no pre-event or during event transports, some on calls, some standby requests, no earthquakes, sandstorms, tsunami, snow, landslide, or sinkhole disaster transports. So to talk a little about a transport plan, you need to have the inputs that you may want to put into them. They need to be carefully constructed. I think any natural disaster plan has got to be approved by local state emergency management agencies. It's got to be part of your animal facilities, local and state emergency operations, and usually should include a contingency plan, you know, different locations, road closures, different routes, weather changes. Certainly the driver must be briefed on the plan and the contingency plan, and a decision has to be made about who activates the contingency procedures. It may also be needed during the natural disasters, alternative communication resources and contact. If you transport animals in the United Kingdom and Europe, you have an animal transport certificate always, and a contingency plan is part of that document that you have for them. In planning natural disaster transports, you must think about CDL drivers and be mindful of the hours of service requirements. You know, they have to only can work 14 hours with 10 hours off in a 24-hour period. And they only have 11 hours driving time. So you need to think about that in your plan. When you're loading animals, how long does it take? How quickly can you mobilize to do a transport at your facility? And how many animals you're going to move? But during a natural disaster that's declared, either by the governor, the president, or a local official, some of these waivers, particularly the hours requirements, are eliminated. So to begin the creation of a transport plan, a description on which animals in the collection may need to be moved. And I've used in the past with some facilities, the institutional collection plan. Certainly it would list where each animal will be housed during a natural disaster, where an animal will be transported to within the zoological park or safari park, or what site it might be transported to a new location. Preparations and disaster training, certainly behavioral training is a component of this. And normally when we have ideal or close to ideal conditions to train animals for crating or injections, we have most ideal conditions for loading these animals into transport vehicles. And usually these activities take place during normal business hours. My suggestion might be that we or should we replicate any disaster conditions in our disaster training, time of day, nighttime, different personnel, smoke, low light, generator noises, so that we're familiar with that. And it also seems to increase the amount of time it takes to load during these sub conditions. If you have planning obligations in your plan, you certainly should review the animal's prior transport experiences. What age, look at the examination and approval of the receiving facility, having loading and unloading equipment, experienced staff at both the loading and unloading locations, and certainly rehearsals and training exercises. The timing of loading is very critical. It's based on the event, how long it's going to take for that tornado to come to you, or your zoo to be flooded, or after an earthquake. Based on the number of animals you have to crate up. And if you load the animals prior to a driver coming that has a CDL license, you'll minimize those hours of service, which of course impacts the number of miles that the animal can be moved. So amount of time of animals can be in crates. Certainly we know that in emergency situations, animals can be days in crates if required. If the animals are conditioned to crates, comfortable in the crates, feed and drink in the crates. And I've done some international transports where it takes 5 to 7 days for an animal to leave and then arrive at the new facility. I think in some other instances by boat, animals have been in crates or cargo containers for 12, 15, 30 days. So the other thing you need to think about for your budget when you're doing a planned move, you may have to do some equipment purchases, crates, you may do some rentals of vans, you may need generators or equipment at both facilities. You certainly have to think about fuel because it's a commodity that's in short supply in some cases during natural disasters. Staff training times, contracted transporter costs, on-call and on standby costs, if indeed that's in your discussion with your transporter. And remember, there may be no ATM or credit card use. Cash might be needed for both the zoo and the drivers. So some alternatives to zoo transport using transporters, certainly local trucking firms, truck rentals, livestock transporters, farmers. I've used some of those or all those in different places. And certainly there's great risks in evacuation and transport and operational limitations during natural disasters. Road closures, rerouting, mass evacuation. You see the pictures of all the people trying to leave the area in the route that's been suggested that's most safe for people to move. You don't want to get caught in that. Mechanical breakdowns, fuel shortages, cell phone outage. If you have mechanical breakdowns, that's certainly a problem during the natural disaster support. And strandings, smoke, and no mutual aid. So another thing that you'd be aware of is if you're doing your own driving or you have a driver doing it, and we're very cognizant with our big rigs that we use, is wind sail and trailer blowover, which can occur depending on the size of the trailer or the weight that you're carrying. Sometimes at sustained speeds of 40 miles per hour, trailers can blow over with the animals in them. And to follow up, I just say with the reality of an ever warming planet, extreme weather events as we see are more and more common, and meticulous planning and preparation and communication, coordination and training will be required in natural disaster transports. That concludes my presentation. If there's any questions, I'd be glad to take them.
Thank you
If
very
not-
much.
I'd be glad to turn it over to Dr. Joseph.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for that. And one thing I have to say before I say anything is always be aware of human safety. In Alan's presentation, which was wonderful, the one thing that bothered me was the guy standing on the forklift. If you have a human injury, human casualty, that will take more than one person out of your operation. So I'm Brian Joseph. I worked in the zoo and aquarium field since 1973 in roles from keeper to veterinarian to general curator to director. I currently am the relief veterinarian at the Seattle Aquarium, provide veterinary care for all of the Merlin aquariums, the aquarium of the Boardwalk in Branson, 2 dolphin facilities in the Caribbean, and do volunteer work for Livestock International, a nonprofit where I work in Kurdistan and Iraq. So I'm going to talk about things from a slightly different perspective. I was a Washington State veterinarian for 5 years, retired in August. And I was also an Army Reserve veterinarian, took as many as 45 people, all their equipment, medications to the Middle East, to Africa, the Arctic Circle, and brought them back again. During the time I was at SeaWorld, I did all their animal transports across the United States and have done a lot of animal transports of marine mammals around the world. So what I'm going to talk about is really what happens before an emergency, because if you are not prepared before an emergency, you are going to be out of luck. I'll talk about the role of various agencies, but I can leave out some of the federal stuff since Frank took care of that. I will talk about the need to establish relationships of trust in advance. A really important thing to do is to brief your agencies in advance. They need to know your plans of action. They need to know alternatives. If you do tabletop exercises, which I would encourage you to do, include those agencies. In an emergency, the welfare of your animals is not going to be the foremost concern of most agencies that you work with. Human safety, economics are going to be their foremost concern. So how much concern they do have for your animals is going to depend on your ability to form relationships in advance. So there's a whole lot of agencies that have a dog in your fight. One of the federal and state emergency agencies, USDA, APHIS, state departments of agriculture, which are really critical, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which you've already talked about, the National Oceanic Atmosphere Administration, which is fisheries. They like to be called fisheries now. County and state departments of health, don't forget them, and don't forget your law enforcement and public safety folks. So talk about the emergency response agencies first. Every state has an emergency management division, and they are going to coordinate and communicate with multiple agencies throughout the state. These folks are really the primary folks that are driving everything in the event of an emergency. FEMA doesn't usually arrive for 2 days, 3 days. And until then, your state folks are going to take care of it. So it's really important to know who they are. If you look at Washington itself, we have county emergency management agencies, we have a state emergency management agency, and then we have FEMA, of course, above all else. Your state departments of agriculture are really important. If you don't know your state veterinarians, get to know your state veterinarians. Other than myself and Ralph Zimmerman, who's the state veterinarian in New Mexico, I don't know of any other zoo folks that have ever been a state veterinarian. And they truly don't understand what zoos do unless you've gone to a lot of trouble to teach them. So their primary concern is always food security and economics. As an example, the combined budget of our 3 largest zoos in Washington, Seattle Aquarium, Woodland Park, Point Defiance, and Northwest Trek, our 4 largest, is less than $100 million. But the annual revenue from livestock and poultry in Washington is $13.6 billion. So that's where they're going to concentrate unless you forge a relationship with them in advance. The other is USDA APHIS. It's very important that you have a relationship with them that's more than just having them inspect your facilities. Your area veterinarian in charge, who may not be the person you see during inspections, you need to know them. And if you have any diseased animals on site or any animals that are serological positive for a reportable disease, your folks in USDA need to know about that, because if they don't know about that in advance, they may not let you transport that animal. For example, if you have an animal that's tuberculosis positive, even if it doesn't have active tuberculosis, unless you've briefed them on that animal, where that animal is going to go, and ensured them that there's appropriate safety measures, they may not let you move that animal. We talked about the wildlife folks yet already, so I won't dwell on them. I would, again, establish a relationship in advance and share your emergency plans with them. Otherwise, they can be slow to react, especially if it's on a holiday or a weekend. Unlike most zoo people, they don't all work 7 days a week. State departments of Fish and Game, their role is to protect the wildlife assets in the state. and they're heavily geared towards hunting and fishing. That's where all their revenue comes from. And they want to protect those species and those environments. We all know that our animals in zoos and our wildlife become infected with domestic animal diseases, but they're not really concerned about that. What they're concerned about is protecting their wildlife, and they need to be assured that there aren't going to be any escapes of animals that can become invasive species. This is a group of folks that you may not interact with very much, but you should, which are your county and state public health folks. In the last year and a half before I retired, I spent half of my time working with public health people concerning SARS-CoV-2. Their primary concern is protection of human health. And they tend to have very limited experience with zoonosis and an exaggerated response compared to the risk. They're very risk averse, and they might tolerate something in a state like 5,000 people being killed by car wrecks. But if one person tests positive for psittacosis, they have a lot of concern. So you need to educate them in advance, have a relationship with them, and mitigate any fears they have about diseases that your animals might have. The law enforcement agencies are really important. When we executed marine mammal transports, whether it was with SeaWorld, the Shed Aquarium, or the Point Defiance Zoo and Aquarium, we always involve the law enforcement folks in the planning. They need to know what you're going to do, where you're going to do it, because again, human safety is going to be their foremost concern. And if you're explaining what you're going to do to any of these agencies during an event, you're losing. The emergency agencies are going to be coordinated with USDA, APHIS, and state agriculture when it comes to crossing borders, but they're going to be very concerned about controlling human safety. And if you want to have people on a truck, for example, you better have discussed that with your law enforcement agencies in advance, because their first response is you can't do that for human safety. So again, this has been very brief. I'm glad to answer any questions. You can contact me later. But it's very important to not only understand the role of these agencies, but to establish a relationship of trust in advance. We all know if you call someone and you're on a first name basis with them, they're more likely to help you than not. Invite these folks out to your zoo, go over your collection, go over your plans, and you'll find things that work a lot better. And make sure you brief them in your alternatives. If you have a tabletop exercise, which I'd advise you all to do, involve them in that. Because, as I say, the well-being of your animals is not going to be their foremost concern unless you give them a reason to care. Thank you for your attention. I'm not sure who's going to be after me, but that's it for me. So.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joseph. Next up, we have Mike Foraker. Mike, if you want to go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about lessons learned from actual evacuations and mobilizations. This is not meant to be all-inclusive. These are just things that you need to consider that you might otherwise think of. First off is getting to the scene. You're going to encounter checkpoints, many of which Brian referred to. You better already have emergency contacts within the state, state and or local. You also should have their phone numbers, because what you're going to encounter is a law enforcement officer who, by the way, is in charge at that checkpoint, and he's not going to know your contacts. You're going to have a contact number to reach out to get access through that. On your way in, navigation is a problem. Chances are, and most of what I've responded to has been floods and hurricane situations, but chances are you're not going to have cell service. There used to be these things called paper maps. Very few of us have them anymore. They are very valuable when cell service is down. You either need that or a GPS unit that can just direct to satellite, because you're going to encounter road closures, flooded areas. Even when you dispatch by boat, you're going to have to find your way into some of these situations without that loyal phone map service that we're all used to using. As you go into one of these situations, top off fuel at every possible point on the way in. You need to go into a site with enough fuel to get out. And what you're going to encounter on the fuel stations is, if a station had fuel, chances are the locals are buying them out of business. When power lines are down, they don't have electricity to pump, nor when computers are down, many of them will just shut down because they don't have access to cash registers. On that note, go in with cash. You're going to encounter a lot of situations where will be no credit card use. We found ourselves bartering on many occasions to get supplies that were needed. When you get to the site, first and foremost, you need to do a safety review of the site with management and staff of the location, but also realize after one of these disaster situations, the staff tends to be in shock or very close to shock. So go around with them, but keep your eyes open. And first and foremost is safety. Safety of your response team. Brian referred to it. You have one person injured, you've lost 2 to 3 other staff to take care of them. Personnel safety and then animal safety. When we go in, we prioritize the situation. Obviously, any loose animal would be a top priority. That tends to be not to be the case once a response team arrives. It usually takes 24 to 36 hours. So usually this has been taken care of, not in all occasions. Second priority would be animals that are in compromised enclosures, potential for escape, or animals that have nowhere to get out of water. We've encountered animals that were just swimming when we got to the situation and had no place to get out dry. Third priority, or third thing to consider would be animals that are safely contained and have a high point to get out of water. Identify these early on. If they can be safely crated or hand caught without tranquilization, that's fine, but you cannot tranquilize an animal standing in flooded water. The other thing to consider is animals that are intact in holding areas and high floodwaters. As long as they can be properly cared for and have a place out of the water, and I'm talking about especially large carnivores, these are going to be the hardest to get out of a situation because you're either waiting in water or you're going to have a high water vehicle to get to them to move one of these heavy crated animals. And in most zoos, you cannot get to all these enclosures in a high water vehicle. So if those animals can be safely left in a dry place, even though their enclosure is flooded, put them last on your agenda. I mentioned tranquilization concerns. That is just always a bad situation in flooded areas. You also need to be concerned about overheating of animals. There's no power for fans or anything, air conditioning or anything like that in these situations. And go back to crating and loading. In a flooded situation where you're working out of a boat, it is going to be impossible to move these heavy crates. You're going to have a high lift or something to get into these. So very carefully prioritize your animals to see if they can last. Typically in a flood situation, the water is going to go down. If it's not compromised enclosure-wise or building-wise, let them sit. They could be, food can be taken to them, they can be cared for there, and hopefully the water can be pumped down. Relocation is another situation that you're going to have to take into consideration. It is just not easy to place all of these large animals at once. Sometimes they can be taken out to a temporary situation in a flood situation when the water is going down. Animals with compromised buildings or enclosures, those are the ones you're going to have to work on placing and transporting. Do my introduction at the end. I've been in the zoo business for 48 years, currently director of the Fort Worth Zoo, currently president of the Zoo Disaster Response Network, which we formed in 2019. You can look that up on the website is zdr3.org. I probably responded to my first flood situation in Chattanooga in 1973. I've done hurricane cleanup and repair for Ivan in Jamaica, Irma and Marie in the British Virgin Islands, evacuated a zoo for Hurricane Harvey, and ZDR3 then became a formalized network, and we responded in 2020 to Hurricane Laura in 2 different locations. I'll take questions now or questions at the end. Thank you. Oh, and I do need to introduce Dr. Yvonne Nadler, who is next up.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to have Haley drive slides for me because my Mac and I are both security challenged today. So I'm pinch hitting for Miss Melinda Arnold. Melinda was is a PR professional that used to be with the Dickerson Park Zoo down in Missouri. She was planning on being with us today, but she had a conflict. So she was generous enough to provide me with some talking points that she thought was really important to share with you all from a zoo professional's experience. And that's her email there, fusionlinkcx@gmail.com if you have any further questions. So go ahead, Haley. So we're going to break this down into a couple of different sections here. And I'm going to talk about some considerations both pre-emergency transport, during the movement, and then, things to think about afterwards when it comes to these communication hiccups, shall we say, that might happen during a transport. And I'm going to reiterate with all of what all of our other panelists have said earlier is please remember that human life, health, and safety is the first rule of management of any incident, right? You guys know that move animals for breeding recommendations or whatever, how beautifully orchestrated these things have become in many facilities. So, essentially sometimes this great deal of planning has to be thrown out the window when you have these emergencies that pop up. So we're trying to encourage you to think about the things that could happen. Do as much pre-planning as you can for those events when things are going sideways. Certainly, confidentiality and safety concerns. We know that we're always worried about confidentiality when things go poorly. But we'll talk a little bit more about that when it comes up a little bit more in the slides. Transparency is also very, very important here. You are going to have a real hard time sort of whitewashing over bad things that happen. So we'll give you some hints to think about when you're working on sort of your PR planning for these sorts of things. What can you pre-plan? Can you do some press releases that have some basic information that you can kind of populate with particular incidents that might come up during a move? This is a photo that I snagged off the internet. This is a story from about 10 years ago where the controversy was these were animals moving out of Canada to a sanctuary. There was all this brouhaha about the best way to move this animal. And this wasn't even an emergency situation. This was, how are we going to get these charismatic animals from point A to point B? And there was a tremendous amount of public interest in how this was going to happen. So as much of that as you can think about ahead of time that might be necessary with a emergency transport, that's really important. And think about who your audience would be for those messages. What are some of the issues that you need to talk about with your staff? Is that more of a logistics related thing? We've made the decision, this is a plan, we're going to execute it, versus what do you need to tell the media and the public if you are working on some sort of pre-planning for, say, a hurricane event? I know we've gotten questions about, well, is the zoo planning to evacuate their animals because the hurricane is coming? Well, sometimes it doesn't make sense to pre-evacuate. So, what message are you going to share with the public that's going to put them at ease that you are doing the best that you possibly can for your animals? Okay, next slide. Okay, during the transport. Okay, this is Rhino Moving LLC. This is like, a house moving, but I just got a kick out of it because, this isn't how we move rhinos, right? Not with human movers, but, rhinos are moved across the country, right? And what, if anything, should be shared about moving these animals during an emergency transport? The fact that Frank had said you need to have these, whether it's police, whether it's a state animal health official, whomever it is, you need to think about who would we need to contact getting this animal from point A to point B. How would we go about doing that? If you're like what Mike said, if your facility is essentially in a blackout area because they've shut down all road movement, who are you going to have to contact? Even if you have the right equipment at your facility, who do you need to contact to get safely out of that facility to the facility where the animal will be temporarily housed. Okay, what is the safety and security that is needed around that emergency transportation? Do you need to share the status of the move with anyone across country? Okay, do you need to pick up that phone and say, okay, state animal health official in Illinois, we are coming out of Indiana. You had pre-approved us moving across the country. We'll be entering the border of Illinois in 30 minutes. We're on this particular highway. Does that state animal health official want that heads up? What are your contingency plans? So do you have a plan for what happens when something bad happens during that transport? Does everybody in the transport, do you have basics for, any kind of equipment repair? Who might need to be contacted if you have a breakdown along the way? Do you have a list of phone numbers of colleagues that might be within an hour or so of your breakdown location that could come to assist you if necessary? All these things are things that we want you to sort of pre-plan before you need them. It will be very, very useful. Next slide. Because if something goes wrong, you can bet you this will be a very high profile incident, right? Is it something, we see all the time? We see, pigs are out on the highway, or, it's now with drones, Chopper 7, iPhones, whatever, people are going to know about this. So the thing that's really important to realize is that transparency is going to be very important with regarding, regardless of who is given permission, who is granted the authority to speak on behalf of what happened in that incident. Okay, if you have a driver or the veterinarian that's along with the transfer, or an animal keeper, are they given any kind of media training when a microphone is put in their face and they have to respond to a interviewer's questions about what happened during this incident? And like I said before, covering up what happened is really going to lead to additional problems. So, make those decisions ahead of time. Who is going to speak on behalf of this shipment if something untoward happens during that movement? Next slide. So again, I just want to reiterate the basics here, because I am not the professional, but goodness knows that in all of our workshops and contingency planning webinars, we always hit these high points when it comes to communication. Again, human life, health, safety is priority one. Please consider what could happen, determine the likelihood, and plan for those high likelihood, high consequence events that are going to happen when you're in an emergency transport situation. Designate that facility spokesperson on scene in case of accidents on the road. Have them practice. It's not that hard to do some role playing, so these people are comfortable answering questions that might be asked of them in these stressful situations. And what sort of information will be necessary to convey to different audiences from sending and receiving facilities in case of issues? Who are those first few contact points that you have to make if you get into trouble? So those are the basics that I can share with you today. And I think I'm the last of the panelists. So I'm going to turn this back over to Ashley and Haley to help curate the questions for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nadler. So we have Dr. Moore that'll be moderating our Q&A panel. We do have a few questions that have already come in. Just a reminder to everybody listening, if you have a question for our panelists, you can click on the Q&A button. It should show up at the bottom of your screen, and you'll be able to put that in for them to answer, and we will moderate from there. If you're having technical difficulties, you can also just chat directly to Haley or myself in the chat. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Moore, if you want to do any introductions, and then we can get started with questions.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks to this great panel. And instead of showing two pictures of me, can we show the panel? That would be much better from my point of view anyway. I'd like to start off with a question that relates to both what Dr. Nadler and what Dr. Joseph were saying. And that is, Brian was talking about a group of non-human primates with a zoonotic disease. So here's my question for you two. And Yvonne was talking about communication and balancing confidentiality against being transparent. So if you have a group of animals, primates, in our case at Oregon Zoo, some very famous elephants that all had mammalian TB or elephant TB, same disease, but they're not, so they're seropositive, but they're not showing clinical signs. Who do you need to talk to? Do you need to talk to anybody? Certainly the receiving institution should know. What authorities need to know from Dr. Joseph's point of view, and from kind of this balance of confidentiality versus transparency, and Yvonne, the PR point of view, how far do you go with that? In Oregon's case, everybody knows the elephants have elephant TB, but in a very, very public. But in a non-human primate case, it might be closely held to the institution. So how do you balance those considerations?
That's a great question, Don. And I've worked through that with Point Defiance with respect to their elephants that had tuberculosis. And I would say if I had not been involved in the conversation with the Department of Health, both the local and the state people, the conversation would have gone very differently. In all cases, my recommendation would be to have a conversation with your Department of Health people in advance, and also your USDA counterparts and your state veterinarians, so that they understand what you're doing to mitigate risk. And that may mean that you have an uncomfortable meeting where the Department of Health comes in, or in the case of Point Defiance, we even had meetings with CDC. But if you're open and honest about it, you can solve these problems in advance, and you can mitigate the risk and make everybody happy. If you wait till the last minute, you could be in a position where someone like Department of Health that doesn't understand, exaggerates risk, might say you can't move those animals, or they can't make you euthanize the animals, but they can make that recommendation. So again, the relationships are all important. Education is all important.
Thanks. Yvonne, anything to add?
Yeah, and I'd like to add that if anybody's on here from the LA Zoo, I'm going to really simplify this, but I believe that in a fire incident not terribly long ago, the LA Zoo allowed a temporary housing of some animals from a sanctuary with essentially, unknown disease status for anything. But what they did is they arranged, the sanctuary was able to bring, they had crates that were appropriate for short-term housing for the animals. The LA Zoo worked on accommodating this trailer with the animals in a separate area of the park, so they could essentially form almost like a line of separation between the LA Zoo's collection animals and the sanctuary's animals. And there was no concern about cross-contamination, but that was something that they had to work out. And then it was to the mutual benefit of everyone. So, it's about being transparent, and it's about trying to establish relationships with the facilities that might be in your area that can manage the species, in the best interest of everybody, both the receiving and the sending institutions, to make sure that we don't have any cross-contamination.
Great. Brian,
Don,
you got your hand up.
Yeah, I'd like to add something. So I can give you an example. It's not a zoo thing, but of a failure of that. Just recently, we're all aware of the evacuation from Afghanistan, which the people who had dogs there knew that was coming. One of the private contractors failed to talk to CDC in advance about bringing dogs in the United States and quarantine them, which CDC, USDA, they'll all work with you to establish a quarantine area. They didn't do that in advance. At the last minute, they wanted to bring their dogs in. Their dogs hadn't been tested properly. And because they didn't have a relationship, they hadn't solved the problem, those dogs were left in Afghanistan. So I find CDC, USDA really easy to work with. You just have to talk to them.
Well, thanks. And I'm going to flip this back to Haley and Ashley, who are curating the rest of the questions.
So going in a similar direction, one of the questions we have is, We've had to evacuate multiple times in the past 5 years, one under very active duress and under mandatory evacuation, one under extreme duress, and two while we were just under recommended evacuation. Since any evacuation has own potential hazards to both animals and personnel, I'm interested in any guidance on how to, quote, know when to go, end quote, particularly considering the effects of multiple day exposure to mild and moderate smoke in the area. Is it okay to wait it out or better to evacuate? We also don't want to needlessly wear out our welcome at the locations where animals are being placed.
I think I'm going to toss that to Mike first, and then anybody else can jump in.
Fires are not my expertise, but I
But
think working with,
evacuation versus not is ZDR3's expertise, right?
yes, I would say working with your local emergency management, they are bound to have established guidelines for humans and agricultural animals, and use that as a guide to develop a plan. And it should be a several layer plan of, at this point, we'll start making arrangements. We call that mobilizing. And at some point you do deploy and evacuate, but you're going to have to work locally to, and I think following the human and the agricultural animal guidelines that are probably in place with your emergency management centers, that would give you a good guidance. Brian, can you, anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, the only thing I would add, because I used to live in a fire area, is always err on the side of caution and evacuate sooner rather than later. If you wait too long, there's going to be more danger to your personnel, more danger to your animals. There may be less road access. Again, as Mike says, coordinate with your local folks, but always err on the side of caution.
And Yvonne, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I used this expression once when I was doing a training seminar on contingency planning, and it's this: the roads are paved with indecisive squirrels, right? If you're going back and forth like this, trying to make a decision on when you're going to pull out, you've not done correct planning. Okay, so I agree wholeheartedly with Mike. You need to kind of sit down and think of this as a staging process. And something that's going to be really important is that your facility has to buy into these set points, because if you've got two or three people in high level positions that start arguing, yes, we need to go, no, we shouldn't go, you haven't done enough of that sort of mind meld that's needed to make efficient decisions quickly. So that would be my addition to this conversation.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to go from step 3 to step 4, that when a decision is made, than to go from step 1 to step 4.
Yeah. Two more hands up, Rochelle. I think you were up first.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate a thing that zoos don't often think about. I saw an interesting way of dealing with things in Australia when they were dealing with the fires, where there were a lot of people that had horses and animals that could easily be trailered. They used a livestock arena to hold those animals outside of the fire zone. So you may be thinking, oh, it needs to be another zoo, but there are often private sector individuals in some of these large states that have a lot of animals that may have facilities that are appropriate for your animals. You just have to break down those barriers and be able to work with them so that you can use them in the event of an emergency.
And were those animals in trailers in the arena, or were they then
The arena, it was like a show arena where they had stables, and there was a horse barn and a cattle barn and things like that. And so all of the farmers were able to move out of their area and move their animals into that facility. Now, obviously with tigers or elephants, that's a little bit more difficult situation, but there may be places nearby you that have those types of animals, but you'd need to check them out. Are they in ahead of time before an incident occurs?
Yeah. Frank?
Yeah, I just want to also mention, you have to know when you need to go, but you also need to know when you need to turn back. Sometimes you feel like once you start going, I'm committed to this. And I know of some routine shipment. Well, I hate the word routine, just a non-emergency shipment where they went out and things started happening and they should have turned back. These are all signs that this is not good. So, sometimes you may have to make that decision that we can't go any further and you just have to turn back. So again, it's the interest of the animals and the humans involved. Thanks.
And I think to the point of having relationships with all of these agencies early on gets to the question of go versus stay, and having a contingency plan, say for your herd of elephants that can survive a flood, or whatever it is that can survive there, to shelter in place and have a plan with the agencies that yes, you have human food and you have animal food and you can shelter in place. And I don't know if Mike or Alan or anybody wants to address that shelter in place idea. Doesn't seem fun to me, but I know a whole bunch of zoos and aquariums have go teams and they've got shelter in place teams ready to respond to a disaster.
I would always comment that if you can shelter animals in place and not put your staff at risk, that would always be the best situation. Obviously, smoke is a different situation than storms and hurricanes. But sheltering in place is going to be far better on the animals if it can be done safely.
Okay. Other questions, Haley and Ashley?
Yeah, a couple of things that just came in on that one. I know the person that asked added that they do try to go early and have used a lot of unusual resources, including even an enclosed greenhouse at a garden supply for some of the animals. So that was added, as well as others stressing knowing if you have lack of gas and cash and considering counterflow of traffic, and that you have enough diet if you're going to be in a long transport. Regarding sheltering in place, second part of a question on that was asking about our buildings with emergency cinder block or on high ground and crate training, or all of those things that facilities are using if they're doing shelter in place plans.
Anybody want to take that?
I can talk about, there's some facilities that have designed that are in flood areas. There's one in Texas that has built in transfer cages to their facility so that they can move to higher ground. They're only moving animals from one part of their facility to another part of the facility. And I think there's engineering and structural things that can be done to prepare for disasters in the areas that you have. Certainly generator buildup. You talk about some of the fire areas, you look at what Los Angeles Zoo does, their irrigation systems that are around the area. They're working with the fire department over there to have training and also to look at the facilities and to look at plant material that maybe need to be removed. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done. And I would just say, if you have those things, shelter in place is probably the best thing to do. And also, as a transporter that's outside, I just don't see how we're going to be able to get there in time to help you guys in many cases. I mean, if the person is local or is on site, or she is on site to do the transports, that can be done. I see that there's not a lot of transports being done based on the number of natural disasters. So I think shelter in place is being done, or the facilities are doing their own transports with non-transport companies. Certainly Oregon Zoo did that with their condors to a facility during the fire. So I guess that's just my take on some of it.
Yeah, and just comment on that one. The Oregon Zoo Condor facility happens to be only, an hour away from the zoo, and the zoo has a very large, brand new veterinary clinic with large animal holding that could hold all of those condors. So that was a case of, having condor crates that were going back and forth kind of with the team. And I think the big issue there was 35 to 40 condors, and they're all eating calf carcasses. So, what's your supply chain look like at that point? And it occurs to me that the one kind of represented field of expertise we really don't have on this call that would have been really useful would have been a nutritionist talking about supply chain and having nutrition supply chain in mind when you're building your contingency plan. And in fact, the water supply chain in mind when you're building your contingency plan because of contaminated water. I think several of you talked about that anyway, but yeah, Rochelle.
Yeah, like I know for down south here in Florida, there are a lot of zoos that will have contracts ahead of time with refrigerated trucks that can, at a moment's notice, they can start that contract. It's already pre-approved with their oversight, so they can pay them. And that's something that's always good to have in your back pocket.
Yeah. Okay, Ashley and Haley, other questions?
Yeah, we have one asking advice on ways that they can help the zoo before a hurricane, with an example given of how they might have been able to assist, like the zoo in Puerto Rico. I know there's other things that come into play there. And then how volunteers could be utilized as part of a plan and emergency for those facilities that are more reliant on a volunteer force.
Mike, do you want to take that first part of the question?
First part being Puerto Rico, or?
Yeah, well, I think it's how you set yourself up to help a facility in advance of a hurricane. And it occurs to me that ZDR3 with the MOU is one of the models.
That would be part, well, I would say that would be part of a contingency plan. We're all being now required by USDA, or will shortly be required, to have a contingency plan. One asset to a contingency plan would be to be a part of a network similar to the ZDR3, and you can access information on that at zdr3.org. We have been able to, in our responses, be able to get into zoos within 24 to 36 hours with the teams. And I really feel like that being a part of this network could be a big value to a contingency plan, because we can get in with qualified help. I honestly discourage the use of volunteers until it becomes a after issue cleanup process, because when we go into zoos with our teams, we're going in with an experienced zoo people, arborists. It's really not a lot of animal people. It's people that can go in and deal with trees down, flooded situations, animal people in the sense of helping the other animal staff. But these really aren't conditions that I'd like to see unexperienced volunteers. If we're talking public volunteers, volunteers from other institutions are absolutely essential. And that's what the ZDR3 network tries to provide.
And just a note to everybody, Ashley did post the link to ZDR3 in the chat. Yvonne, did you want to comment?
Yeah, and two things, I think. I want to echo what Mike had said. I mean, volunteers may be very valuable for certain functions of your facility, but I think you have to be extremely concerned about, injuries to volunteers that are acting on behalf of your organization at the time. There's going to be a lot of liability with that. A suggestion might be, certainly, monitoring social media, or, getting the word out about this is the proper link to provide support. $5 to the zoo would help. Something that is not going to potentially harm the person is pretty important if you want to get them involved in that. Or say, after we get things cleaned up, we'll have a better handle on what's going on, and you can help us with the next fundraising ball. Or, make sure that they're recognized, they're valued and included, but I don't recommend them in the middle of a response type situation. The other thing I wanted to add is the ZAP partnership has been, notified now and again about the issues with the Puerto Rico Zoo, and we have tried to reach out to people, but from what we understand, the leadership down there is changing on a regular basis. We have had some people that have sent materials down that doesn't ever get to where it needs to go. So, we aren't really intimately involved in that. And since to my knowledge, they're no longer USDA licensed, USDA doesn't really have much of regulatory authority over them either. So, we're concerned and sort of in the same, darkness about that as well. So, if anybody has any suggestions or contacts, we're always willing to help. Essentially what we do is we provide information about contingency plans, could try to act as a conduit for information. We even involved 2 veterinarians that did internships there, and they still had a hard time, connecting with the right people. So it has been very frustrating. If you are frustrated, we are as well. So
The Fort Worth Zoo has we managed 3 or 4 different conservation projects in Puerto Rico. We're very in touch with the DNR and all the officials down there. We have tried to engage at the Mayaguez Zoo several times, and exactly what Yvonne says, we'll engage with one group that claims they are in charge, only to be pulled off and told, no, it's another group in charge, and they are infighting down there on a regular basis unless something has just recently changed. We have tried, but can't get anywhere.
Wow, Rochelle.
Yeah, I know we're focusing a lot on the animals, but the staff also suffers during these responses. I know after Hurricane Andrew, they set up an area near the commissary where the keepers could get fresh socks, toiletries.
Yeah.
Sometimes the people need as much help as the animals do. There were even keepers at the time, sadly, that didn't have a home to go back to and were sleeping at the zoo, and the zoo said, you guys got to go, we can't let you stay here. And so there's really also a human issue as well as the animal issue.
Absolutely. And I want to go back to a comment that Yvonne made, checking social media. Part of that is checking on your friends, making sure that the staff is okay. Here we are on a pretty nice day, October 4th, across the United States. I'm getting a text message every 20 seconds saying that Facebook has crashed and it's down, and you can't check on anybody on Facebook, so don't even bother to try. It reminds me of kind of the earthquake situation in DC a few years ago. Social media goes down, the phone goes down, everything goes down. And so you should have contingency plans for communication too. And that might involve, I don't know, runners, people on bikes. It depends on where you are, people in trucks. Anyway, other questions, Ashley and Haley?
Yes. So next question is, there is a rumor out there that airlines will no longer ship animals within a couple of years. Is there any truth to this?
So I'll answer that. And just for background, I've been working with Iata, the International Air Transport Association, since 2003, and I'm on their animal advisory board. I haven't heard anything like that. I know it's harder to ship them because of the fewer airlines, especially in the US, but we are constantly working in the international community on revising and reviewing a lot of the animal transport requirements, and I haven't heard anything. I think that's just a rumor, but it is getting harder and harder. So I think maybe that's where it stems from. But if you have problems with the airlines, let me know, and I can try to help you work through that.
Frank, Bruce Clemens just responded in the chat. There's no truth to that rumor.
I was hoping he would say that.
Thanks, Bruce.
But yeah, there's and Bruce is the vice chair of the Live Animals and Perishables board, so he would know that. But the airlines, like everybody has said, if you work with the airlines, if you make them part of the shipment, not just, and they want to protect the animals as much as you do. And they know that, I think it's really good to have a good relationship with the local airline cargo areas, just so that they understand what the zoos are doing, and really involve them with what you're doing and make them part of that conservation plan. And I think that really helps.
Thanks. Ashley and Haley, other questions?
Yes, this one I believe was for Alan. Is there an organized, updated list of transporters that those of us putting contingency plans together could gain access to?
No, there's no listserv, or there's no grouping of these transporters. I think you just find out that most zoos have some that they're very familiar with using, very comfortable that they're using. I'm not saying a list can't be generated, but and the people that I paired. You know, some of them do strictly AZA transports, some of them do ZA transports, some cross the border, some only do private individuals. So, but I think it's something we could work on and get it together. Certainly the people that I talked to had no problem being quoted in this meeting or their opinions given in this meeting. They're very opinionated people and very professional. So I think it's something we could generate, but there's no list that I know of.
And Yvonne, would you like to speak briefly to the kind of Zoom call that we just had the other day and trailer transporters?
Yes. I believe Mr. Jeff Hill is on our webinar, and maybe Dr. Mike Gilsdorf is too. Dr. Gilsdorf is previously with USFWS, and we had an opportunity to kind of cross-connect on a disease tabletop exercise. And I was talking about, trailers and, could we ever move animals out of areas that are affected by foreign animal disease, blah, blah, blah. So of course, you know how one chain of people starts that communication rolling. And it's resulted in a couple of really interesting conversations with Mr. Jeff Hill. He's with Livestock Welfare Strategies. I always want to say solutions, but I believe it's strategies. And a group of folks from the AAZV community, AZA, we just sort of started talking a little bit about this. Just some folks that I just kind of said, oh, maybe you'd be interested in this. And we essentially what it's come to is we're going to start expanding a little bit of a working group to look at what current technologies exist in transport equipment. And the livestock industry has just done an unbelievable job in developing some of these super biosecure trailers with, it blows my mind what's out there that, I had no idea existed. So we're going to start talking about, what might we want or need as an industry to move animals, our zoological collections or wildlife safely, more efficiently, potentially in a much more biosecure manner. But, we don't know until we start talking with one another. So Don was on the call. We had a couple of zoo vets on the call. We had a guy that had some experience with both moving swine, regulatory, zoo. So we're kind of getting all these folks together and just start talking about some of these ideas. So as this continues to evolve a little bit, we know everybody's busy. We'll we may have another webinar and talk about some of these updates that we've learned in this process of sort of thinking about these things moving forward.
And the trailers are amazing. So anyway, more later. Hey, we've got about 3 minutes, and I'd like to leave a few seconds for all of the panelists to provide us with closing remarks. So can we start at the top with Frank? I think you started us off.
Sure. And thanks, Donna. Thank you for organizing this. I think this has been really valuable. I know somebody put in their comments they want to see the A to Z about animal transport. Many years ago, somebody came up to me and said they need to make transport, animal transport for sort of like for idiots. And I said, idiots have no business transporting wildlife. It's really complex, and it has to be that way. One of my mantras is I think I told you earlier, there's no such thing as a routine transport. Every time it's different. And we're looking for innovation. If you have suggestions for how we can improve the individual methods, let me know. This is a real partnership between everyone involved, like everyone has mentioned here. And it's something that is continually evolving. And in an emergency situation, having all those ideas is really, really important. And being able to call on the network is really important. So thanks again for the time here.
Thanks, Rochelle.
Yep. Thank you also for inviting me to speak. And I also want to bring up, some states have organized AZA zoo groups. Florida has the FAZA, California has CAZA, and the FAZA every year puts out a new contact list for emergencies. So there's always a statewide, awareness about hurricane season and things like that. Also, certain taxa of animals like birds are really lucky because there's usually a lot of bird clubs in states that love birds, and they love to come to the rescue of the zoo to help them with their birds, with food, crates, maybe a holding facility. So certain taxa of animals have a easier time than others during an emergency. Thank you.
Thanks. Alan?
I would just say it's a timely topic because of all the natural disasters that we're hearing about and the natural disasters that are going to occur with the warming of the earth. So I think, you know, it's going to be a continued thing and accelerated rate, I believe. So I would just say for, you know, planning for your transportation, you got to have a plan. You got to be able to work the plan. You got to have people that can implement the plan, and you have to have approval of that plan at a higher level than your zoological park. You've got to work with your local responders and the people that are in charge of disaster relief and disaster planning in your area in order to be successful, in order to do the prosper things for your animals.
Thank you. Dr. Joseph.
Sure. First, thank you for including me, and I'd very much like to work with all of you further on this. And one thing you should do when you plan transports, I learned long ago when I started moving whales around, is plan backwards. Plan for the success at the end. And if you work backwards, you'll come up with a much more rational and real time frame. The other thing is plan for everything going wrong, because at some stage, virtually everything will go wrong. And so you need redundancy in equipment and people and security and safety. And human safety is always first and foremost. Don't ever forget that. Thank you.
Thanks. Mike.
A couple of points. Don touched on it earlier. Communication. If you need help and can't call out, you're not going to get help. Consider a Garmin unit. They're in reach. They're called in reach. They run about $300. They are good for satellite texting, and they will work unless the satellite comes down. And if it does, we're all in trouble. I was encouraged by the questions on preparedness. That's the key. That's the place to start. Everybody needs to be working on that and having a plan in place. And then I would also encourage you to go to zdr3.org. Our network is now in 17 states, those 60 members, and we really haven't started a recruitment team yet. The ZAP people have worked closely with the development of this, and we think it's really developing into a good network. So go online and you can see some of the responses that are already in place. We need more institutions. Consider. Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. Nadler.
Yeah, I really want to thank everybody for joining today. I didn't do the math in my head, but I bet there's 400 years of zoo experience, if not more, sitting in front of you this afternoon. So, and we're all here because we want successful outcomes, right? So, you know, if you need help with planning, if you don't know where to start, you know, reach out to ZAP. We can help you, or we can connect you with people on the panel with specific questions, so you can continue to just build the resiliency within your facilities. There's a dozen things that we could talk about and spend a week or more on every single topic, but we thought that this was really timely, and I can't thank the panelists enough.
All right, and I'll take it back and just thank everybody for being here, especially people from outside the zoo profession in the transport fields. Thank you for joining us today. Appreciate that you were participants on the call, and thank you to the panelists. Great job. I think we covered a lot of stuff. Still need a nutritionist, but we'll do that next time. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ashley and Haley for anything closing.
Thank you all so much for joining today. Thank you, panelists, for your time and expertise. We will be sending out a survey from this session, so please provide your thoughts to all those that attended. If you have ideas for things you'd like to see in the future, follow-up questions, that's a place to put that as well. And we'll be ending the recording now, but we will leave the line open for just a couple of moments if there's anybody finishing up conversations or that had follow-up questions. So thanks very much and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Have a safe one out there.